Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on Our Own Devices. I'm Jean Messier, and courtesy of the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada and the Fort Garry Horse Regimental Museum, today we have quite an impressive spread of, well, not quite forgotten weapons, although some of these were certainly used under certain circumstances as weapons, but let's say forgotten firearms. After all, don't want to get sued by Ian McCollum. This is a collection of World War II flare pistols. Now, today, when we think of flare pistols, we tend to think of them as a solely emergency signaling device. You carry one in a survival kit, and if you find yourself lost at sea or out in the wilderness, you use it to signal to rescuers. But flare pistols actually have a very long history as general-purpose signaling and communication devices, especially in the military. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the classical flare pistol that's break action and fires a shotgun-like cartridge was patented in 1877 by a U.S. naval officer named Edward Very. And this is why in certain countries, such as the UK, flare pistols are also known as Very pistols. So Very's invention was very quickly picked up all around the world by navies and merchant marine services and quickly became a standard piece of maritime equipment. And while, of course, they were used for signaling distress, they also had other uses. We have to remember that this is in the days before radio, so the only way that ships could communicate with each other or with the shore was via visual or auditory signals, so say foghorns and whistles and bells, flag signals, semaphore code, Aldous lamps for flashing out Morse code, and in this case, flares, and a whole language, a whole system of signals based on different combinations of colored flares was quickly developed. They could also be used for illumination in the middle of the night or in fog, say using parachute flares. And one of the weirdest uses of flare pistols was as a line launcher. And there were also larger pieces of artillery designed to do this. And the idea is you would use the pistol to launch a special projectile that had a line attached to it. And you would use this to launch that line to a foundering ship, either from a lifeboat or from the shore. And oftentimes this was used either to tow that ship ashore or away from danger, or sometimes used with something called a breeches buoy. And this is basically a life ring with a pair of canvas shorts attached to it. And you would use the line launched by the flare pistol to set up a pulley and cable system that you would attach the breeches buoy to, and then the survivors of the foundering ship would basically get into the pants and would be winched ashore. Now, although flare pistols were adopted by several armies at the end of the 19th century, it really wasn't until the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War that they really became common in combat. And by the time of the First World War, they had really become an integral part of tactics. So this is just like out at sea. In the days before portable radios, you really had very few ways of communicating with troops on the advance. Yes, you had telegraphs and later telephones, but these took time to set up. You really couldn't spool out telephone wire while the troops were advancing into the enemy trenches. And so you had to use whistles. This is why officers carried whistles, and in this case, flare pistols, in order for units to be able to communicate across the battlefield. And so this could be used for a number of different things. You could use a flare to start an attack, to coordinate an attack among multiple units. If you arrived at the enemy position and successfully took it, you would fire off a certain color or combination of colors in order to say, we've captured our objective, send in the following waves. If you're pinned down by enemy fire, you can fire off a flare either to signal that you need backup, you need extra reinforcements, or that you need an artillery strike on the enemy. You can signal that you're encountering more resistance. You can signal a retreat. You can signal all sorts of things. But the specific combination, the specific code, was not standardized. It actually changed from day to day, from operation to operation, and from unit to unit. And there's a very good reason for this. If the enemy picks up on what your system of signals is, they can very easily spoof your signals and lead you into a trap. So say a unit advances to take a position and gets annihilated. If the enemy then sends up a signal indicating, oh, we've successfully captured our objective, well then the next wave will not expect any resistance and will walk right into an ambush. And to give you an idea of this, I actually have a manual of signals that was prepared before an Anglo-French attack in June of 1918. And as you can see, for the Australian Corps, green over green over green signals SOS. White over white over white is a success signal. We've reached our objective. For the Canadian Corps, red over red over red is either an SOS, we are held up and cannot advance without help, or the enemy is counterattacking, while green over green over green is lift your fire, we are going to attack, or stop firing, whereas 3 white very lights in quick succession is we've arrived at our objective, and for the 31st French Corps, they are to be notified later. And one can only hope that the French got the memo before the attack took place. Now, another very common use of flare pistols during the First World War was for illumination. For example, if you're a sentry out at night, you hear something moving in no man's land, you can fire up a bright parachute flare to give you light for a couple of seconds. You can see if there's a trench raiding party coming towards your trench. So you can see that flares were a very integral part of combat tactics and would remain so well into the Second World War, even when portable radios became available. Now, while the use of flare guns in a naval or ground combat context is fairly well understood, what is less well known about is the vital role that flares have played in military and civilian aviation. Now, for about the first 30 years or so of aviation, radios weren't really carried aboard aircraft, or at least not very commonly, because they were heavy, they were bulky, they were fragile and unreliable. They weren't really suited to aircraft, and aircraft really weren't suited to them. So pilots had to use a whole bunch of alternate signaling methods in order to communicate with other aircraft and with the ground, and vice versa. And this included hand signals, flashing lights for Morse code, carrier pigeons, and interestingly enough, the use of carrier pigeons actually continued well into the Second World War. It's, a form of communication that seemed almost medieval even by the time of the First World War, but during the Second World War, bomber crews would carry a few pigeons to communicate with home base if their radio was disabled or if they were shot down. So old technology, but it still works. And of course, another useful method of communication was flares. And flares could be used for all sorts of different things, and they were a vital part of pilots' equipment for many years. And in fact, you look at pictures of aircraft from the First World War, and a lot of them have very prominent racks for a flare pistol and a bunch of cartridges. This is especially apparent on the Fokker DR-1, most famously flown by Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. It has the holster externally with a whole bunch of cartridges. And flares could be used for any number of purposes. For example, if you're a bomber stream forming up over a target and you want to maintain radio silence, after all, you don't want the enemy homing in on your radio signals, you can use flares. So the lead bomber would fire off a flare, and the other bombers would form up around them. And of course, the pathfinders, the aircraft that went and located the target with high precision, would then mark that target using larger, more powerful flares, colloquially known as Christmas trees. Flares were also used as a form of IFF, identification friend or foe, to indicate that you were a friendly aircraft. So if you were coming back, say, from a raid over occupied Europe and landing in England, as you approach the airfield, you would fire off a certain combination of flares to let the ground crews and the anti-aircraft crews know that you are a friendly bomber returning and not an enemy bomber coming in for a raid. And just like on the ground in the First World War, these signals would be changed every day. They were called the colors of the day. And interestingly enough, the Luftwaffe used a similar system of flare signals, and there are reports of Allied bombers caught in anti-aircraft fire, firing off random flares, hoping that they would clue in on the German flare combination of the day and get the flak to stop. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Now, while the system worked most of the time, when it didn't, it could lead to real tragedies, especially since ground forces and air forces tended to use completely separate systems of signals. And there's a particularly infamous incident that occurred on August 8, 1944, during Operation Totalize, which was part of the Normandy breakout near the city of Caen. And what happened was that the ground forces were using yellow flares to mark themselves as friendly forces, whereas the heavy bombers that were supporting the attack were using yellow flares for the pathfinders. And so you can imagine what happened. the heavy bombers mistook the IFF flares for their Pathfinder signal and dropped their bombs directly on the Canadian and Polish troops, killing about 300 of them. And this was really a wake-up call for the Allied forces, where they realized that they needed a standardized system of signals so that this wouldn't happen again. So another way that aircraft would use flares during the Second World War was to signal their status on approach to an airfield. And according to Ernest Walthall, who was a United States Army Air Force officer during the war, a typical set of signals would be green for all is well. This was an informal signal, he says, that would just be fired off like celebratory fireworks to say we've completed our mission successfully. Yellow meant the aircraft was severely damaged, and red meant that they were wounded aboard. And this was to signal to ground crews what sort of equipment and personnel to bring to the airfield, such as a fire truck or an ambulance. And of course, the ground crew could use flares to signal to aircraft what the wind conditions were, what the runway condition was, if it was damaged by enemy bombing, things like that. And this continued well after the Second World War. Anyway, that's a brief history of the use of flares in the military. Let's actually have a closer look at these flare guns and see how they work. So let's begin in the United Kingdom with 3 flare pistols manufactured by Webley and Scott. The first model right here is the No. 1 Mk.V, and this was used from the end of the First World War to the beginning of the Second World War. And this is essentially just a steel version of the No. 1 Mk.III Star, which itself was a modified version of the No. 1 Mk.III. And both of those were made of brass. A lot of flare pistols were made out of brass because they originally intended to be used in a marine environment, and brass is very corrosion resistant, even in salt air. But for use by ground troops, they wanted something that was a little bit cheaper and easier to manufacture. Brass is very expensive, and so they produced a blued steel version. So if you want to take a look at this, this has a curved bird's head style grip on it, and the distinctive flared muzzle, almost like a blunderbuss. And this is actually a safety feature that was added to the Mk.III Star, and the idea is to protect your hand. It's to prevent your hand from going over the muzzle when you open the gun to reload it. And to reload it, you have a very simple release on the top that hinges back. You break it open like a shotgun. You have your little extractor here, and you just load in your cartridge, close it, and this is single action, so you actually have to cock the hammer and fire it. It's really as simple as a flare gun can be. So just before the Second World War, these were starting to be replaced by these. These are No. 3 Mark I flare pistols. This one dated 1939, this one 1941, and that's important. We'll look at that in a second. Now, these were designed to take the new standard cartridge, which was 1.5 inch or 37 millimeters. And those of you who know your imperial to metric conversions will know that 1.5 inches is actually 38.1 millimeters, but in the official literature, these are listed as 37 millimeter. So you can see that these are considerably heftier. They've got a much larger bore, and interestingly enough, the rear part is basically the standard frame from a Webley Mark VI standard service revolver. And I don't have an actual one, but I do have a very faithful airsoft replica. And you can see that if you hold them side by side, from the breech backwards, this is essentially just a Mark VI. However, there are some differences. For example, the very convenient thumb release for the brake action on the Mark VI isn't included on this. Rather, there's a rather awkward sort of falling block release with a little knurled pad at the top. It's very hard to use while holding the gun. You press down on that, and it releases, and the barrel tips forward. You can load your cartridges. You have an extractor just like before. Now, the other difference is that unlike the No. 1 Mark V, which was a single action only, this is a double action only. So you actually can't cock the hammer. There's actually no spur on it. You have to pull the trigger all the way back to fire it. So I mentioned before that there is an important difference between the 1939 model here and the 1941, and that's this little mechanism on the left-hand side of the gun, this little latch here. And what that is an opening safety. So if you open up the gun and then close it, the latch engages, and this makes it impossible to actually pull the trigger. The hammer doesn't fall, and you need to release that latch in order to actually fire it. And the idea is that once you've loaded it, then it's automatically on safe and you deliberately have to release the safety in order to fire it. But as useful as that might have seemed on paper, apparently in reality it was more trouble than it was worth, because if you actually look at the 1941 version, it has been completely omitted. And this makes a lot of sense because the trigger pull on this is so hard, there's very little chance that you are going to accidentally fire this. It's inherently safe on its own. Now, another big flaw with these is that these are very complicated and expensive to manufacture. This is a very hefty piece of metal and it's all machined. There's a lot of complex milling work that goes into making this barrel, and this ended up being way too expensive, especially at the beginning of the war when the British are scrambling for equipment. So eventually this is replaced with the No. 4 Mark I, which used a lot more forgings and stampings and castings and easier to manufacture parts. And this became standard for the rest of the war. Now, that particular flare gun included a very interesting feature, but we're not going to cover that right now. We're actually going to take a closer look at that when we look at one of our next flare guns. Anyways, moving on. All right, so let's go across the pond and have a look at some American flare pistols. Now, during the Second World War, the various American armed forces used a variety of different flare pistols in several different calibers. For example, the Navy had something called the Signal Pistol Mk.V, also known as the Sedgley, and this was a rather large Buck Rogers ray gun looking thing, also break action, and that was chambered in 10 gauge or 22 millimeter. They also had something called the Submarine Rocket Pistol Mark I, which had an enormously long barrel, and this was, as the name implies, carried by submarines, and the barrel was to accommodate a rather large and very powerful parachute flare. However, most of the US Armed Services tended to use the standard 1.5-inch or 37mm cartridge, and the flare pistol they went into the Second World War with was this one, the M2. Now, what's interesting about the M2 flare pistol is that this is actually a muzzleloader. You see, whereas the British used flanged or rimmed cartridges like this one, the Americans used rimless cartridges, and this allows you to load through the muzzle. So you depress this little latch on the side here, drop the cartridge in, and then the latch closes and holds onto the rim. And then this is double action only. You click on the trigger, and it fires. So this particular example is chromed. So far as I am aware, this was not standard. I believe this was done by an owner after the fact. Most of them during the Second World War would have been brass with no plating, because the brass itself would have been corrosion resistant enough. So just holding this up like this is quite tiring. This is a heavy block of brass, and the amount of skilled machining work that had to go into this is just baffling. There's a lot of really complicated cuts on this. And this seems like a lot of wasted effort for just a flare pistol, for something that's not supporting a lot of chamber pressure. And indeed, for this and other reasons, the USAAF would move on to simpler, easier to manufacture designs. Now, the M2 had other flaws. For one thing, it had enormous recoil. You really had to hold onto this with two hands to safely use it. And airmen had difficulty using this out of aircraft. You see, when you're firing this, you really do not want your flare to hit any part of the aircraft. So you have to hold this as far away from the fuselage as possible. However, if you just hold this out a window, the slipstream is going to take it out of your hand, and it's goodbye flare pistol. So in order to address these issues, the USAAF adopted instead this. This is an AN, Army-Navy, M8 flare pistol, and this would quickly become the standard for the remainder of the war and afterward. So this is made of sheet metal stampings and other easier to manufacture components. Indeed, during the war, most of these were actually manufactured by the Eureka Vacuum Company, and is considerably lighter than the M2. I'm not straining to hold this up. And what's interesting about it is it's sort of an inter-service flare pistol in that it can take two different types of ammunition. If you lift up this hook at the back, it pops open like that, just like a regular flare pistol, and you can feed in a British-style flanged or rimmed cartridge, or you can keep it closed, and you can put in an American-style rimless cartridge. You just pop it down the muzzle like that, it clicks in place, and doesn't fall out. You crack it open, and it falls out once it's spent. This is double action only, and the hammer is shrouded so that it doesn't catch on anything. Now, as I said, this hook right here is to break open the action, but this hook up here is rather interesting because this works in tandem with these lugs on the front of the barrel. And I mentioned that the Webley No. 4 Mark I had similar lugs, and in both cases the idea is the same. This was designed to lock into a device known as the M2 flare gun adapter. And this was designed to be mounted on the fuselage of an aircraft, and it had a little hinged door to open it to the outside airstream. And what you would do is you would take the flare pistol, put it into the port, and rotate, and these lugs would lock it in place, and so would this little plunger. And what this allowed you to do was safely fire the pistol out into the airstream outside the aircraft. And it had springs inside to absorb the rather harsh recoil of firing these flares. And it also had a little trap door, like I said, that you could open to allow the flares to leave. And this eliminated all the problems of the M2 in terms of firing out an aircraft. And I'll show you some pictures here of one of these mounts in a B-17. This would be mounted in the pilot's compartment up above on the ceiling so that the flares would fire straight up and away from the aircraft. So as I said, these were standard issue for the United States Army Air Force for most of the war and afterwards. They were also adopted after the war by several allied nations, including Canada. This particular one is marked with electropencil as property of the RCAF. So a very simple, very clever, very effective design. And finally, we head back to Europe to have a look at a trio of German flare pistols, or as they're known in German service, Leuchtpistole, or light pistol. Now, the first flare pistol officially adopted by the German army was the model of 1894, more commonly known as the Hebel. Now, this doesn't refer to the manufacturer or the inventor, it simply means lever, and it refers to the lever under the trigger guard used to break open the action. And like all subsequent German flare pistols, this was chambered in a 27mm cartridge. Now, the Hebel was used throughout the First World War, and while it was, by all accounts, a fairly robust and simple design, it did have a number of flaws. Number one, it was very poorly balanced in the hand, what with the very long barrel. It also used forged leaf springs, which tended to wear out or crack. It also had a very big spur on the hammer, which tended to get caught on things. Now, a lot of the Hebels were actually destroyed at the end of the First World War. As part of the Treaty of Versailles, the Entente powers were desperate to disarm Germany as thoroughly as they could, and so they introduced an amnesty where civilians could bring in any firearms they found, and a lot of people turned in flare guns, and they were destroyed, meaning that in post-war Germany, there was a sudden shortage of flare guns. So in steps Fritz Walther of the Walther Firearms Company, and he produces in 1926 a new version called the Model of 1926. And this introduces a number of improvements over the older Hebel model. It's better balanced in the hand, it's held together with pins instead of screws. This is important because the recoil of these flare pistols tended to shake the screws loose. It also made it a lot easier to take apart. There was only one set of screws on it, which was to hold the hand grip panels on, so you could easily take it apart with a punch. And it also had a flush hammer that wouldn't get caught on things, and a number of other safety features, such as a safety that prevented the gun from firing if it was cracked open or if it wasn't fully locked, and also retracted the firing pin so that even if you dropped the flare pistol, the firing pin was nowhere near the cartridge primer, so you couldn't have an accidental discharge. And these sold very well. They were sold to the military, which was very small at the time due to the Treaty of Versailles, but also to civilians, to mariners and railroad companies and the police and whatnot, and sold very well. Now, in 1935, when the Nazis had come to power and were starting to rearm the country, Walther produces an upgrade to the Leuchtpistole 26, which is called the Leuchtpistole 34. And one of the things he does is trim the barrel down from 230 millimeters to 155 millimeters to make it lighter and a bit more convenient. And subsequently, all the model of 1926s that had the long barrels, almost all of them, were trimmed down to the new standard. So it's very rare to find an original model of 1926 with the long barrel. Now, that change was implemented when the model of 1934 was still being produced in steel. Shortly thereafter, Walther introduced probably the most dramatic change was to produce the model of 1934 in aluminum, specifically an alloy of aluminum called duralumin, which is 95% aluminum, 4% copper, 1% manganese. And these are extremely light flare pistols. This weighs hardly anything at all. And if we look a bit closer at it, we can see what it's inherited from the older Hebel, such as this hexagonal frame over the chamber, the transition to the barrel, and of course the Hebel itself, this little lever under the trigger guard, which if you pull it forward, pops open the barrel. And this is spring-loaded, unlike all of the other flare pistols that we've seen. A key feature of the German ones is that spring to pop the action open and to eject the cartridge. And to close it, you just pull the Hebel forward and snap it closed. It's actually kind of difficult to do. There we go. And you'll see also that the hammer is almost flush with the frame, so it's less likely to get caught on things and, snag on a soldier's equipment or cause a negligent discharge. But this is also single action only. You cock it back like that and fire. So because this is made out of aluminum and it can't be blued like a steel firearm, this is anodized, in this case black, to protect it from corrosion. And this has hand grip panels made out of bakelite. They actually started out as wood, then they went to bakelite because it was cheaper. It actually went back to wood because that was more available at the time, in 1943 about. And then it actually swapped back and forth a number of times depending on what was most available to the German manufacturing system. And in fact, at one point, there was a shortage of aluminum, so they actually made these out of zinc, which was an interim version. Now, what's interesting is this little feature at the back here. This is a little hole, and what that is for mounting this vertically on a tripod. There was actually a kit that came in a little canvas case for mounting this, and there were a number of different reasons you would want to do this. One is to use what's known as an M-patron or Messpatron, which is a very bright, very powerful light cartridge, and that is for calibrating the sights of guns. If you need a reference point on the battlefield in order to calibrate all your targets, you would set this up in a certain location, and then you would actually have a lanyard attached to it so you could fire it remotely. And it would go up, and everybody around who was sighting in their weapons would be able to use that as a very bright reference point. There was also a Fallschirm cartridge, Fallschirmpatron, which was a parachute cartridge, which was used to track the wind. So again, you would mount this on your tripod, and you would pull it with a lanyard, and it would fire up, and then you would follow the drift of the parachute to determine where the wind was blowing. And the reason you wanted the tripod for this was, number one, it's very hard to attain a perfect vertical shot just by hand, and number two, to achieve that very straight trajectory, the cartridge had to be very powerful, too powerful for you to safely fire it by hand. Hence, you mounted it on a tripod. And the last thing to note about this particular model of 1934 is that it doesn't actually have any Waffenampes on it, German Army proof marks, meaning this was likely a civilian pistol. So something you start to see with German firearms towards the end of the Second World War is a move towards simpler manufacturing methods, especially the wide-scale adoption of steel stampings. And this is because the German industry is running out of resources. Factories are being bombed, supply lines are being interrupted. They can't afford to make these precision machined high-quality firearms, so they go for whatever is the cheapest and easiest to manufacture in large quantities. And this goes for flare pistols as well as every other type of firearm. Now, the Leuchtpistole 34 is simple and lightweight, but it's also still fairly complex to manufacture from aluminum. So in 1943, the Germans introduce a new type of flare pistol called the Leuchtpistole 42, which is made entirely out of steel stampings. And this greatly simplifies manufacturing and makes it a lot cheaper to produce, but at the cost of weight. This is significantly heavier than the 34. It also works in a slightly different manner. Rather than having the lever under the barrel, you instead have a little button on the left-hand side. You push that, and it pops open. It's still spring-loaded, just like the previous models. You also have a flush hammer here. It's very, very stiff, and this is single action only. And the grip panels here are made out of a material that's basically wood pulp mixed with resin. And this is very common on German firearms at the end of the war, sort of a last-ditch material when wood or bakelite wasn't available. So I mentioned at the beginning of the video that on occasion flare guns had been used as actual weapons. And this tends to be a sort of last-ditch spur-of-the-moment thing where soldiers find themselves ambushed and they don't have any other weapon available other than a flare pistol, so they pick it up and use it as a weapon. But at the end of the Second World War, as the situation was getting very desperate for Germany, they were desperate for any sorts of weapons they could find. So they actually started converting their flare pistols into bona fide weapons. And these were known as Kampfpistole or Sturmpistole. So these consisted of a Leuchtpistole 34 or 42 fitted with a shoulder stock and sights and provided with a variety of explosive ammunition. There were several types of cartridges that this could take. There was one type that was a small anti-personnel fragmentation grenade, which was the same size as a regular flare cartridge and could be loaded from the breech. There was one that was a wooden or plastic stem that could be screwed onto a Model 1939 Eierhandgranat or egg grenade. And then you had a separate launching cartridge. So you'd put the cartridge in through the breech, you would put the stem with the grenade through the muzzle, and then you could fire it like a rifle grenade. And then finally there was a heat or shaped charge warhead that was meant for use against tanks, but this is a rather pathetic little warhead. It could only penetrate about 8 centimeters of rolled armor, which was practically useless against anything that the Allies were fielding at the time. So these things were only used against armored cars and other lightly armored vehicles. They were pretty useless. So interestingly enough, one of the non-lethal general signaling cartridges that the German army used was, technologically speaking, even more interesting than any of the offensive rounds they developed for the Sturmpistole. And this was called the multi-star signaling cartridge. And it consisted of a standard 27mm flare cartridge, but it had several channels inside holding 6 red and 6 green stars. And you could actually twist the cartridge to choose different settings, a different order of firing. And what this would do is actually align different flash holes from the primer to the different stars. And so you could choose between 6 different combinations of order of red stars and green stars to create different signals. And hopefully one day I'll be able to get my hands on one of these because that just sounds like a neat piece of design. And finally, let's have a look at this big boy. I was very excited to cover this because this is a very rare bird indeed. This is known as an SLD, a Signal- und Leucht Doppelschussmodel, a signal and light double shot model. And this was specifically designed for the German Kriegsmarine, the Navy, and it is a double-barreled flare pistol. And this is built very much like a civilian break-action shotgun, although with some features inherited from earlier flare pistols. So to open it, you use the same Hebel underneath the trigger guard, you pull that forward, and it pops open with spring action. You can load your cartridges in, also 27mm, like all other German flare cartridges. You can close that down. It actually has a safety on the side, so Sicher und Feuer, safe and fire. And then you have a selector on the top that allows you to choose one barrel or the other barrel or both. And then like other flare pistols, this is double action only, although this one has actually been deactivated at some point. You can see there's the remains of a weld on one side of the barrel here, although the Fort Garry Horse Regimental Museum has restored it to somewhat functional condition. There are no firing pins inside, and you can see that the firing mechanism has been disabled. It actually doesn't do anything when you pull the trigger, but it's at least in presentable condition. Now, something that it is missing is the wooden forestock. It had a big, beefy wooden forestock that screwed into these 2 little holes on the bottom and allowed you to have a firmer grip on this when you were actually firing. Now, I mentioned that these are quite rare. Well, 4,000 of this model, which is made out of steel, were made, and these were mostly issued to U-boat crews. And given the attrition rate of U-boats, it's unsurprising that most of these went down with their respective ships. So today in the world, there are only about 100 of these left. So very rare, and I'm very excited to be able to actually take a look at one. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and a huge thank you to the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada and the Fort Garry Horse Regimental Museum for allowing me to borrow these flare pistols and film them. and an especial thanks to Gord Crosley, who was kind enough to remove the rust from these, oil them, clean them up, and make them pretty for the camera. And it's just really neat to be able to look at so many different styles and designs of flare pistols, because really these were vital to military tactics for so many years, and yet they're really not written about all that much compared to other firearms. Anyway, I will see you next time on another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on Our Own Devices. Until then, I'm Jean Messier. Have a great day.